Hello, and welcome to Reduce Compliance Risk with Trustworthy AI. I'm Brian Alexander, and I'm the CEO of Almana Technologies US. We are a full service AI engineering firm. So there's a lot of different statistics I could have put up to talk about increasing compliance risk. And here we're talking about regulatory risk, the increased throughput of regulatory change. We're talking about the broader compliance risks, including risks of non-compliance, the reputational risks, the risks of fine, the risks of litigation, the risks of other regulatory agency action. And we can see here there's been a 500% increase in regulatory changes in developed countries between 2008 2016, although there are a few short periods of time where there was a decrease in the number of pages published in the Federal Register. The trend is clearly continuing to go up, and we expect that to continue, and that relates directly to the number of major and minor rules published in the Federal Register. And on the subject of particularly trustworthy AI, we know that many agencies are looking at how organizations are using AI. And in this case, we've got something from the SEC 2021 examination priorities, where they say they will focus on the implementation and integration of RegTech in firms' compliance programs. And of course, they also talk about how important RegTech is to compliance and how it's becoming more and more important. The current state of compliance management. We all are familiar with many of these things: the lack of awareness of true compliance risks, the reactive and proactive processes and compliance programs, the inefficient and ad hoc processes, and information silos, and the failure to understand relationships between requirements and the organization. Now, on the right, we've got a compliance maturity model, and this is quite a simple one. There's, of course, the reactive and proactive levels, and most companies are working in that space. Now we want to talk about predictive, that is using AI, and that is analyzing data to predict potential and future compliance risks, and also to preemptively understand how to mitigate those risks. Here we have an AI-enabled compliance framework, and this kind of flow is fairly typical. Companies have different processes. Sometimes they're more ad hoc, but this is really about building a compliance library. So we're starting with public and private data sources, and we're looking at any areas where there are requirements or obligations relevant to the organization: acts, regulations, rules, standards, contracts as well. And I sometimes use regulations more generically to include acts, rules, standards, everything else. But the next stage is the filter. And this is obviously a very important area, because this is where we're looking at what is important to the organization from a compliance standpoint. And we're looking at compliance risk, the lines of business, the products and services, and the jurisdictions. And you can see where this is a place where a chatbot would be highly efficient as a UI in order to gather information and determine which public and private data sources need to be tapped in order to build a compliance library. The next thing we want to do is look at the requirements and identify them. And so we need an embedded definition of requirements. That's important because we don't want to look at the requirements that are in the statute that say that the government needs to do something, the agency or the Congress needs to do something. It needs to be the regulated entity, the organization. And so that's an important factor. And at each of these different stages, we've got a trust checkpoint where there's human control, where there's the ability for a teaching feedback loop that allows the stakeholder to provide information back to the system that then can be used the next time around. And furthermore, the AI can determine and predict a risk rating that also can be viewed and adjusted by the stakeholder. But based on the information in the system, a risk rating and priorities can be created. So we want to include those compliance requirements that are relevant to the organization, exclude others, and next we want to associate them with the organization. That is, we want to predict using the AI associations between requirements and the business units, the policies, the controls, the products and services. And we can also put a compliance risk rating on that as well. And in that case, what we're doing is really building risk ratings that can be then rolled up to the business units and departments and ultimately to the organization as a whole to set priorities. Now we're looking at the next step, which is the AI-enabled regulatory change framework. And here, once again, we're starting with the public and private data sources. We're looking for changes. We're monitoring for changes. And then the system is once again filtering and identifying those changes that are relevant. And they may include things in the library. They may include things not in the library. That's important. So if, for example, a new part to the CFR is issued by the Fed, and that's the primary regulating entity, then obviously that's a new part that would need to be added through in the system. So the filter is important, and it's used to identify changes to risk-rated requirements and to present that data to individuals who will then take that information and take the actions necessary to maintain compliance. So the next stage here, and again, we've got a stakeholder input checkpoint here where you can build trust in the system and you can do a teaching feedback loop. And in this case, what we're doing is we're identifying those risks based on the relationships of the data and the information, the organization, the policies, the business units, and the controls that are impacted. And then ultimately, in the next module, the system looks at treatment, and that is predicting what actions need to be taken to maintain compliance, which is a critical aspect to all of this. Putting the right information in the right people's hands so that they can make efficient decisions on what needs to take place in order for the organization to maintain compliance and to mitigate and minimize risk. Now we come to the NLP methods that we're talking about. So what we're doing here is we're using AI to compare words, to compare sentences, to compare blocks of words. And there are different methods to do that, and they have different advantages and disadvantages. And in building trust in the system, it's important to understand those advantages and disadvantages to ensure that the system is set up in a way, and each one of the different microservices are set up in a way that will build trust. And so, when we look at knowledge-based systems, we're looking at systems that are looking at the semantic similarity, that is the similarity between words, between blocks of words, based on information derived from one or more knowledge sources. So that's a two-edged sword. And I've got some examples here of some of the different methodologies used that are considered to be knowledge-based, but the advantages really are that there's the flexibility of a domain-specific knowledge source because the actual meaning of the text is considered, the definition of the text, and the knowledge base is the source for that information. It can accurately handle ambiguity like synonyms and idioms, but by the same token, it can be limited by the knowledge source, because if you don't have a good knowledge source, then that's going to cause problems. If the knowledge source is not domain specific to the particular area of law of compliance, then that can create problems. And furthermore, there are a lot of knowledge sources in English, less so in other languages, although that is changing. And that is an issue because you're looking at the actual meaning of the words. When we come to the corpus-based methods, we're looking at the similarity between the semantic similarity between terms based on large corpora of data. So we're looking the positives to that is that it's language and domain independent and can be adapted easily to different languages. Word embeddings can provide definitional flexibility in terms of the system, but it requires a large clean corpora of data. And we'll talk about word embeddings and also knowledge sources on the next slide, and we'll look at a few of those. The other thing with the corpus-based systems is that there's sometimes an issue with meaning conflation deficiency, and that's because there's limitations of word embeddings. You can't attribute the words to different word meanings, and that becomes an issue. With deep neural networks, you're talking about using convolutional operations or pooling operations or some combination of those. Again, this is high level, but they generally outperform other methods when the training data is good. But at the same time, they can be a black box, which means interpretability is very low, and they also require large computational resources. Ultimately, these hybrid methods, which combine some of the above methods, can be the best because they can take into account the meanings, the advantages of some of these methods, and also mitigate the disadvantages of the methods. We look at knowledge sources, we're talking about ontologies, lexical databases, and dictionaries, and this is important for trust. They need to be focused in the domain. So you have some out there that I've listed that are, used fairly commonly, but in the legal compliance and risk space, there are also knowledge sources that can be used. Legal knowledge interchange format, which is a British organization, the FIBO, Financial Industry Business Ontology, Investopia. I've got the Blackstone Law Dictionary, but also in the regulations, there are definitions, and in standards, there are definitions as well. Word embeddings, when we're talking about the corpus method, are really vector representations of words. I've got some there. A lot of them are underlying, the different methodologies are underlined by the Wikipedia, Google News, or Google. Also mention organizational data, and there are many other aspects to that, but that is important to building trust in the solution, frankly, whether it's manual or whether it's predictive and using AI. And finally, with testing as well, data sets used to evaluate the strength of the solution are important, and those are typically going to be word or sentence pairs where there's some kind of similarity values that have been assigned. So trustworthy AI to reduce compliance risk. First of all, introducing AI is going to increase efficiency and automating the processes, and that is important and one of the great benefits of AI. But stakeholder trust is important. Because that'll support adoption. And at all of these levels, trust becomes important. And for all stakeholders, that is the business risk and compliance analysts and managers, the C-suite people, also, of course, the auditors and the regulators. And trustworthy AI, these are all concepts that are building in some of the guidance coming out of the EU and other space, and these are all important in their own way to reduce using AI to reduce compliance risk, the explainability and interpretability aspects, being transparent and auditable, that is being able to look at the whole system, at how things work, and being able to look back and see how predictions were made and audit how those predictions were made. And of course, having humans in the loop and having an interactive system where humans have that trust checkpoint. So thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it. Please submit any questions, and we've got a Q&A or roundtable coming up after this as well. So I hope that you'll join us there. Thank you.